JK Rowling is back in the headlines. A Tory Police and Crime Commissioner has been reprimanded for sharing a tweet by the author in support of women's rights. A male-dominated panel of counsellors found Lisa Townsend had not been dignified or respectful to trans people when she supported the best-selling author's view that biologically male rapists were not female. They said the Surrey PCC had broken the code of conduct for her office and demanded she explain herself to the three men who had reported her over the tweet, one of whom is a local Conservative MP, Crispin Blunt. So the Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, Lisa Townsend, joins me now. Lisa, thanks very much for joining me today. Good
evening.
Can you talk us through what happened here? Because it does sound like an extraordinary story. You simply shared the tweets, is that right?
Not quite. I did share the tweet. So I've been thinking and talking and tweeting about this, what for me is a women's rights issue for quite some time now. And JK Rowling had tweeted following a case in Scotland around women with penises committing rape. And I retweeted it and I added a comment to it saying, essentially, I think my frustration came out quite clearly, saying that, you know, women wouldn't put up with this anymore. We would not be gaslighted by these men who had no intention, actually, most of them living as women at all, but suddenly wished to declare themselves as women once they'd committed rape. So I retweeted that. As you said, there were three men who made a complaint, one of whom was a local MP in Surrey, where I'm PCC, and the panel came out with their decision, sent me their decision on Tuesday of this week, which of course happened to also be International Women's Day.
Right. I mean, that you couldn't really make that up, could you? It's almost like that was planned in a way. But this is an amazing thing to me because, you know, the substance of these tweets, if you go back 5, 10 years, no one would consider this remotely controversial, would they?
No, I don't think they would at all. And we found ourselves in this slightly odd space where, of course, speaking truth is seen as you say, deeply controversial. And those of us who do get called bigots and TERFs and, you know, suffer all of the bile and everything that goes with that. And it's quite strange because I'm perfectly prepared to accept, and in fact, I welcome that there are people who have different views on this subject. You know, clearly the three gentlemen who complained do. It would seem that the majority of the subcommittee of the panel take a different view on it. And that's good, that's healthy in a democracy. I think what's not healthy and what's actually quite sinister is when people try to shut down the debate. And that's exactly what these men were trying to do. They were trying to shut down the debate rather than let's have it out in the open, let's have these conversations and make sure that everybody is respected and, you know, and has the rights that they deserve.
Can I ask you, what was their justification given? They're saying that you hadn't been dignified or respectful. What was their justification for their ruling on this?
There wasn't really a justification. It's entirely subjective, really. They decided that it wasn't, and therefore, you know, they felt that I should write letters. They haven't. I should be clear. They haven't asked me to apologise. They haven't asked me to remove the tweet. They just asked that I explain myself in a letter to the three men who complained. And it is entirely subjective. I mean, there were complaints made about a previous article that I'd taken part in, and there were over 40 complaints to that, and they found there was no case to answer. So it is entirely subjective and actually, I think, quite political.
And when I see this week, I know JK Rowling has been tweeting an awful lot about this issue ever since International Women's Day, well, long before that, but this week in particular. And a lot of the responses to her tweets, they're not engaging in a dignified way. They're not seeking respectful debate. They're saying things like, shut up, TERF, or, you know, just throwing insults and mudslinging. Have you experienced a lot of that yourself?
Oh yeah, I get it a lot. I get it in my DMs a lot. You know, everything from die TERF through to, you know, if I see you, I'll kill you, and then the usual sort of slurs that you get that are a bit more public. And I think, unfortunately, as politicians, and particularly as female politicians, talking about pretty much anything, we come across that. But this issue is clearly, I suppose you could say, it is quite toxic, and there are people who have invested an awful lot in sort of attacking those of us who are insisting on standing up for women's rights. I think what's interesting is, of course, the vast majority of the attacks, and in fact, I'd struggle to think of any attacks that have come from women. They all come from men, arguing that they should have more rights than us.
So what is the solution to that? Because if there is a contingent of people who are just not willing to discuss, I mean, you've made it clear tonight that you consider it part of a democracy to have a respectful discussion and debate about these issues, but that's not what's happening here. Is it the case that politicians are just going to have to assert certain truths irrespective of the reaction that they face?
I think that's always been true. I think it's probably true more so now in society, perhaps, than it's ever been. You know, we've talked about fake news a lot over the last few years. I think we're also got a society where there's a certain group of people who see things as about being all about themselves and not about sort of the wider context. And so this idea of I must be treated and addressed as I see fit, and never mind everybody else, and I deserve access to this space regardless of whether actually the law supports it. And I think on an awful lot of issues, it's very difficult being a politician. I do understand it. I've worked for a number of MPs in the past, and it's difficult. And for a lot of reasons, you don't want to get involved in controversial debates. And I should say, I would never criticise anybody for choosing not to get involved in this debate. But it does seem to me that there are some very, very serious questions being asked. And ultimately, as politicians, we all put ourselves forward to the electorate. The people of Surrey will decide in a couple of years' time whether I'm right or wrong and vote me back in or out as appropriate. And I think that we all have to be very conscious of that as political parties and as individual politicians.
Can I ask you, just given your expertise, what you think about the argument that, or a lot of perception that people have, that the police themselves have taken a side on this issue? And there have been all sorts of cases where the police seem to be very partisan about this, and they've been targeting feminists, for instance, who put up stickers that have caused offence, but they don't do the same when extreme trans activists put up stickers that threaten violence. Do you think that perception is fair?
I think there's an element of it, certainly, and I've commented on this in the past. I have concerns around Stonewall's influence in particular on policing. And it is quite worrying. And I understand partly where the police are coming from here. I think that for many, many years, policing had a huge problem with discrimination, whether it was around race and ethnicity, whether it was around disability, whether it was around homophobia even. And I do think we're experiencing a bit of an overcorrection here, but I am very concerned about any politicisation in the police. And I do think that they are treading on sort of a very fine line here in being overly political.
And can I just ask you finally about the politics of this? Because JK Rowling this week very, very specifically took on Keir Starmer and said that Keir Starmer was misrepresenting the Equality Act and that therefore the Labour Party is not, or seemingly is not fit to support women's rights. But is this really a partisan issue? Because we see this among Conservative MPs as well. There seems to be, it's not so much a left-right issue as just a general bewilderment.
And it shouldn't be a political partisan issue, I should say. I mean, it's very disappointing, actually, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and a lot of Greens find themselves in the position that they're in. And I get a lot of messages from women saying, I could never vote Labour, but I could never vote Conservative. I could never vote Labour again. I could never vote a Conservative, but, I'm really concerned with which way these parties are going. And again, I think in a healthy, lively democracy, we need a healthy, lively opposition and one that is appealing across the board. And it seems quite clear to me that that's not happening at the moment with Keir Starmer. It seems quite clear to me, looking at the law, that he has absolutely misrepresented the law, that he's doing the old Stonewall trick of spouting the law as he wishes it to be and not as it actually is. I don't think he's a malicious man. I don't think he's doing it on purpose, but I do think the Labour Party are in danger of tying themselves in knots on this issue. And I really hope that we don't see the same in the Conservative Party.